Our idea of totalitarianism is based on the Cold War. We think of the Soviet gulags, we think of the secret police, we think of bread lines. The problem is we don't really understand what totalitarianism is.
A soft totalitarianism is gripping the Western world, and it's our fear of suffering that's allowing it to take hold, says Rod Dreher. He's the author of Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents.
That one lone Chinese protester in Tiananmen Square who stood in front of the tank. You want to be that guy, but that guy didn't become that guy in that moment. Everything that led him to that point had built in him the kind of conscience that gave him that courage.
In the face of growing tyranny, how do we stand our ground and hold on to our values, our conscience, or our faith? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kelly. Rod Dreher, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I've been reading Live Not by Lies. I've been meaning to read it for a while. I've had an incredibly powerful, frankly, experience of reading it. I'll just say it straight up. But you contend something in this book that's very foundational to the whole, I guess, concept of what you're talking about, that a kind of soft totalitarianism, as you call it, is here and ever expanding. And there's some people who would agree, but I think there's a lot of people who would wonder what you're talking about.
Well, it sounds crazy to North Americans to think that our society, our liberal democracies, could be turning totalitarian. I thought it was crazy too when I first had this proposed to me by a physician here in the United States who called me one day back in 2015, I think it was, and we had a mutual friend, and he was very anxious. He said, look, my elderly mother lives with me and my wife here in America. She was born and raised in Czechoslovakia and spent 4 years in a communist prison being tortured for her Catholic faith before she came to America. And she said to me, son, the things I see happening in America today remind me of what things were like in my homeland when the communists first came to power. And this is what the doctor told me, and I thought, well, you know, my mom is old too. She watches a lot of cable news. Maybe this old lady's just being an alarmist. But I made a habit of whenever I would travel to conferences and things like that, if I would meet someone who had emigrated to America from a communist country, I would simply ask them, are the things you're seeing happen in America today in terms of cancel culture, wokeness, things like that, does it remind you of what you left behind? Every single one of them said yes. And if you talk to them long enough, they would get really angry that Americans don't take them seriously. Now, I think one reason we don't take them seriously is because our idea of totalitarianism is based on the Cold War. You know, we think of the Soviet gulags, we think of the secret police, we think of bread lines and censorship and so on and so forth. Well, we don't have that now. So how can this be totalitarianism? Well, I think the problem is we don't really understand what totalitarianism is. It's a word and a concept that emerged in the 20th century by, of all people, through Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy. It's a word he came up with to describe a system in which everybody believes the same thing. The state has power over every aspect of life. And this is what we saw emerge in Nazi Germany and also in, of course, Soviet Russia and the countries that Soviet Russia took over. What does this have to do with us? Here in our liberal democratic societies, we are seeing the expansion of a philosophy that, for lack of a better term, we can call wokeness. It has to do with identity politics, it has to do with like critical race theory, gender theory, all of these things in this broad idea of wokeness. It has conquered all of the institutions of American life. It has conquered first universities, then the media, then it went on to sports, law, medicine, even of late the military and the CIA. So the government doesn't have to get involved necessarily to enforce the wokeness when you have all the other institutions doing it. Most important of all is capitalism, woke capitalism. When big business absorbed critical race theory and gender theory and all of these things and started enforcing it within their companies, as is their right to do in our liberal democracy, it was game over. because in a liberal democracy, a capitalist democracy like ours, when big business wants something, it sets the tone for the rest of society. So what the people who grew up under communism are seeing is that when you live in a society where people are afraid to say what they think for fear of losing their jobs or being sent to the social margins, when people come to realize there is only one opinion tolerated, whether it's coming, enforcement's coming from the government or from the institutions in society, it's still totalitarian. And finally, I should say that our idea of totalitarianism is only focuses on politics, but in a totalitarian society, we certainly have one political party or leader that rules, but everything in society becomes political. So today you have things like last summer we had during Pride Month, Kellogg's cereal put a pronoun guide on the side of breakfast cereal boxes for children. And they encourage children to come up with their own pronouns. They have turned breakfast cereal into an occasion for propagandizing for this woke propaganda. This is the sort of thing that people who grew up under communism, they see it everywhere, that this is infesting all aspects of life. But we Americans and other North Americans and even people in Western Europe, our idea of totalitarianism is gulags and breadlines, so we think we're free. What these people who came up under communism are telling us, we are increasingly unfree. And if we don't wake up now to what's happening, we're going to lose our freedom, and this soft totalitarianism is going to turn hard.
You have some pretty incredible stories that you've discovered, or at least made me aware of, through reading Live Not by Lies. And you kind of open with a man named Father Kolokovich, who basically went out and sounded the alarm to Christians ahead of time, seeing something that nobody else was seeing. And I think in a way, you're trying to be sort of today's Kolokovich, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. Father Tomislav Kolokovich was someone I had never heard of, but he turns out he's one of the unsung heroes of the Cold War. In 1943, he was a Jesuit priest in Zagreb, Croatia, his homeland, and he was doing anti-Nazi work. He got a tip that the Gestapo was coming to arrest him, so he escaped and went to Slovakia, his mother's homeland, and began teaching in the Catholic University in Bratislava, the capital. Now, because Father Kolokovich had done, in his seminary studies, had studied the Soviet Union, because he wanted to be a missionary there, he understood the communist way of thinking. And he told his students, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is, when it's over, the Soviets are going to be ruling this country, and the first thing they're going to do is come after the church. We have to be ready. So what he did was bring together these groups for prayer and study and discussion. Most of them young Catholics. There were a few priests who were involved. They would come together and talk about what they were seeing happen in their society around them, talk about what the teachings of the Catholic Church had to say about what they were supposed to do in the face of this, and then they would make an action plan to go out and do these things. Within 2 years of Father Kolokovich arriving in Slovakia, each town of any size had one of these Kolokovich groups, prayer groups, reading groups, study groups, and they laid the groundwork for the underground church. Now, this is so interesting. The Catholic bishops of Slovakia chastised him. They said, Father, you're frightening people. It won't happen here. It can't happen here. Stop scaring people. But Father Kolokovich did not listen because he had studied communism. Sure enough, when the Iron Curtain fell over Slovakia, the first thing the communists did was come after the churches and the church leaders. The only reason that there was an underground church in Slovakia for the 40 years of communism is because Father Kolokovich and his early followers laid the groundwork and prepared people for what was to come. I believe here in the West today, we are living in a Kolokovich moment when Christians, non-Christians, anyone who is likely to fall into the category of dissident from the woke regime, the soft totalitarian regime, is going to be persecuted. It's already starting to happen in some places. It's soft now. I think it won't stay soft forever. We have got to use the liberty we have now, the time we have now, to build up the structures and the networks that will allow us to hold on to our faith and to our religious practices and be resilient in the face of suffering.